Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to go deep?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're diving into a, well, pretty sensitive and important topic in the autism community.
Yeah.
Gatekeeping. We
Yeah.
got a ton of interesting blog post titles and an article from Cheap ABA. It's called Autism and Gatekeeping. Who gets to decide what's autistic enough?
Sounds like a good one.
Yeah, should be fascinating. We're really going to try to understand how gatekeeping shows up, like, the harm it can do and how we can make things more inclusive. So I think this is super relevant to, well, anyone who wants to better understand autism and help create a more welcoming community. So before we get into the weeds, can you give us a clear definition of what gatekeeping actually is in this context?
Sure. So the article defines gatekeeping as, well, it's basically like controlling access to resources, support, and social networks, all based on things like diagnosis, symptoms, or even personal experiences.
Ah, okay.
Like creating these barriers and deciding who's in, who's out, often based on really, really narrow criteria.
So it's about who belongs and who doesn't, which seems, well, pretty exclusionary, especially for a community that's supposed to be about, like, shared experiences, right?
Right.
And the article breaks it down into three main types of gatekeeping: diagnosis, symptom, and experience. And I think some of the blog post titles we have really highlight this. For example, autism symptoms in Black women, camouflaged or overlooked, and 5 reasons why autism is missed just jump out. How do these relate to diagnosis gatekeeping?
Those titles point to like a historical bias in how autism has been diagnosed. Basically, the diagnostic criteria were often based on observations of white boys,
Oh, wow.
which led to a lot of underdiagnosis or misdiagnosis, particularly in, girls, people of color, and other groups.
So people who don't fit that, like, narrow mold might struggle to get diagnosed and get the support they need.
Exactly. They're excluded before they even have a chance to understand themselves.
That's really rough. And that leads to symptom gatekeeping, right? Where people judge how someone's autism should look. And I see that in some of these blog post titles. Things like oversharing is not trauma dumping, a perspective for autistic individuals, and talking to yourself, a form of stimming. These really get at how much certain behaviors are, well, misunderstood.
Yeah, totally. Oversharing for an autistic person might actually be a different way of communicating, and talking to oneself could be like a form of self-regulation or stimming, which are pretty common ways of coping with sensory input or emotional overload,
That makes sense.
But when these behaviors are judged or labeled as weird, it can lead to a lot of social isolation, even within the autism community itself.
So it's like they're being told their way of experiencing the world isn't valid, even by people who are supposed to understand the challenges. And then, we have experience gatekeeping. We have titles here like The Toxic Interaction Between Autism and Narcissism, or Autism and Organized Religion, a deep dive into Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah.
What kind of gatekeeping do those represent?
These examples show how, even within the autism community, there can be judgment or dismissal of certain experiences, like someone's family dynamics, religious beliefs, or personal challenges might be minimized because, well, they don't fit a particular narrative.
So their experiences are seen as less valid,
Well,
less authentic.
yeah, exactly.
So it's not enough to just get a diagnosis then. There's this pressure to conform to a really specific idea of what being autistic means.
Right.
What does that kind of pressure do to people who are already navigating a world that, let's be honest, often misunderstands them?
It just makes things so much harder. Imagine being told your experience isn't autistic enough, or that your diagnosis isn't valid because you don't fit a mold. It can really make people question their identity and feel, well, incredibly isolated.
And that isolation, that can be incredibly damaging, right?
Absolutely.
It can prevent people from asking for support and make them feel like they have to constantly prove their autism.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to understand how harmful gatekeeping can be. It really strikes at the heart of the human need to belong. Everyone wants to feel seen, understood, and accepted for who they are. And, well, gatekeeping creates these artificial barriers that prevent people from finding that sense of belonging.
It's almost tragic, isn't it? This is a community that should be all about, like, providing support and understanding, and yet there are these barriers that prevent people from truly feeling accepted.
Yeah, and this kind of gatekeeping often comes from a fear of losing the validity of one's own experience.
Ah.
Like if someone else's experience doesn't fit the typical autistic mold, it challenges the narrative some people have built around their own identity. But the truth is, autism is a huge and diverse spectrum, and there's room for everyone's experience.
That's such an important point. Diversity is the reality, and we should be celebrating it, not using it to divide people. But this exclusion is happening, so how do we move towards a more inclusive community? The article mentions embracing diversity as like a key strategy. What does that look like practically?
Well, embracing diversity starts with acknowledging that the autism spectrum is incredibly broad. There's no one right way to be autistic, and we need to celebrate that range of experiences and ways of being. We have to stop trying to, fit everyone into a box.
Love that image, breaking free from the box. It speaks to recognizing that each individual's journey is, well, unique and valid. But how do we actually start breaking down these boxes? The article also mentions challenging stereotypes. Where do we even begin with that?
Challenging stereotypes. Well, we have to be proactive. We need to educate ourselves and others about, the realities of autism and actively dismantle those harmful, outdated stereotypes that fuel gatekeeping.
So it's about more than just like passive acceptance. It's about active advocacy and education. So we're talking about changing minds, changing hearts, and ultimately changing behaviors. That's a tall order. But these blog post titles actually give us some tools to start those conversations.
Oh, they totally do.
Yeah, there's so much richness and diversity in these titles, and we can use them to, like, challenge those misconceptions and broaden our understanding of autism.
For sure.
For example, we can challenge the idea that autistic people lack empathy. We have titles like Autistic Communication and Our Challenges, Understanding Double Empathy and Recognizing Neurodivergent Discrimination. Understanding double empathy, etc. They point to a different way of experiencing empathy. It completely flips the script.
Right. The concept of double empathy suggests that communication breakdowns often happen because of differences in neurology, not a lack of empathy on the part of autistic individuals.
Wow, that's fascinating. It really makes you think differently about how autistic people experience empathy. And this title, Recognizing Neurodivergent Discrimination, suggests that communication breakdowns, while they might be a two-way street, both the neurotypical and neurodivergent person need to make an effort to understand each other.
Exactly. And there's also that myth that all autistic people are the same. Titles like Autism and Atheism, Exploring the Connection, or Understanding Somali Autism Rates Among Immigrants show just how diverse the autistic community really is.
Yeah, they highlight how autism intersects with other identities, cultures, and experiences.
It's a reminder that there's, well, no one-size-fits-all approach to understanding or supporting autistic individuals. And just like we shouldn't assume all autistic experiences are identical, we also shouldn't assume that autistic people don't want relationships.
Yeah, you're right. We have these blog titles like The Importance of Friendships for Children and Teenagers or Building Positive Relationships in Families with Autistic Children and Teens that talk about that,
Yeah.
like that universal need for connection.
Right.
It challenges that harmful stereotype that autistic individuals are, inherently antisocial or incapable of forming meaningful relationships.
Exactly. These titles highlight that everyone, autistic or not, desires and deserves connection and belonging.
Yeah. It really makes you wonder where that stereotype even came from. And this whole conversation about embracing diversity and challenging stereotypes makes me think about like creating those inclusive spaces, both online and offline. That's another key strategy from the article, right? So what are some practical ways we can create those spaces?
Creating inclusive spaces, well, whether they're online or offline, involves being mindful. Mindful of the language we use, the environments we create, and the way we interact with each other.
So it's about being really deliberate, thoughtful in how we approach those interactions. Like what might that actually look like?
Well, think about it this way. Online, it could mean, being aware of how we talk about autism, avoiding judgmental language, and centering autistic voices. Offline, it could be about things like creating sensory-friendly spaces, being mindful of accessibility needs, and just fostering a culture of respect and understanding.
So the common thread here is creating that sense of safety
Right.
and belonging,
Yeah.
where people feel, well, comfortable expressing themselves authentically.
Exactly.
And that leads us to their final strategy in the article, listening and learning. This feels like, the foundation for everything else we've been talking about.
Oh, it absolutely is. Listening and learning is crucial. It's about approaching each other with curiosity and a willingness to learn from different perspectives. We need to actively listen to autistic people's experiences, validate their feelings, and be open to challenging our own assumptions and biases.
This reminds me of a time when I felt so judged for stimming in public. People were giving me these weird looks, and I don't know, I felt so much pressure to just mask my behavior, just to fit in. It's moments like that when you realize how important it is to have those spaces where people feel comfortable being themselves, without judgment.
Yeah, that's such a powerful example. And it just shows how much we still need to learn about respecting neurodiversity.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play in creating a more inclusive world.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that even small actions can make a big difference. We all just commit to listening and learning and challenging our own biases. We can start to break down those barriers that gatekeeping creates.
And that's how we create a community that reflects, like, the true richness and diversity of the autism spectrum. We move from judgment and exclusion to curiosity and acceptance.
That's beautifully put. And it really speaks to the power of individual action, right? We don't have to wait for someone else to fix things. We can all start making a difference right now. But, you know, it's also important to acknowledge that change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, it takes effort, and a willingness to, well, to be a little uncomfortable.
You're absolutely right. This is an ongoing process, and it requires us to constantly be reflecting on our own biases and assumptions. We have to be open to being wrong, to making mistakes, and learning from them.
So what can our listeners do, like today, right now, to start putting these ideas into practice? What's one tangible thing they can do?
I say the most important thing is to actively seek out autistic voices, autistic perspectives. Listen to autistic authors, bloggers, speakers, follow autistic creators and activists on social media, engage with their content, and just be open to learning.
That's great advice. Instead of speaking for the community, amplify the voices within it. Let those with lived experience be the guides. And I think these blog post titles we looked at are a great starting point. They give us a glimpse into that vastness and diversity of the autistic experience.
They remind us that there are so many ways to be autistic, and each of those ways is valid and valuable.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, it's important to remember that creating a truly inclusive autism community, well, it takes all of us. It takes us being mindful of our own biases and assumptions.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just understand what gatekeeping is. We have to challenge it where we see it, even within ourselves.
Yeah, it's about shifting our mindset from judgment and exclusion to curiosity and acceptance. It's about advocating for a world where everyone feels a sense of belonging.
This deep dive, it wasn't just about information. It was about, well, inspiring action. So as you go about your day, think about the ways, big or small, that you can contribute to a more inclusive and welcoming world for autistic individuals. This has been, wow, such a thought-provoking conversation. We really went deep into the complexities of gatekeeping in the autism community.
Yeah, for sure.
So as we start to wrap things up here, what would you say are the most important takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we all have a responsibility, to create a more inclusive and welcoming environment for autistic individuals.
Yeah, totally.
And, well, it all starts with recognizing that the spectrum of autism is so vast and varied. Just like all those blog post titles we talked about.
Yeah, each of those titles represents a unique perspective, a lived experience, and it deserves to be heard, right, and valued.
Exactly. So instead of trying to impose our own, limited definitions of what it means to be autistic, we need to listen with open hearts, open minds.
So approach each other with curiosity.
Yeah.
And a willingness to learn from different perspectives.
Exactly. And be willing to challenge those biases, those assumptions, even when it feels uncomfortable.
This deep dive, it wasn't just about understanding gatekeeping. It was also about, well, encouraging you, the listener, to think critically. Think about how we define and include others within the autism community. It's about recognizing the power we each have to make a difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We can all contribute to a more inclusive world for autistic individuals, whether it's, small everyday actions or bigger efforts to advocate for change.
It all starts with a shift in mindset.
Right.
From that judgment and exclusion to curiosity and acceptance.
And a commitment to creating spaces where everyone feels seen, heard, valued, regardless of, well, where they fall on that autism spectrum.
So if the spectrum of autism is as vast and varied as those blog post titles suggest, what responsibility do we each have to make sure everyone feels like they belong? That's something I hope you'll think about as we finish this deep dive into autism and gatekeeping. Thanks for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.